We begin with a brief examination of a century of interaction between America and Iraq. These two nations have, within context, experienced a tumultuous relationship spanning over the course of decades. The first Americans to encounter the region were evangelical Christian missionaries who swarmed across Iraq beginning in the 1830s and who built hundreds of churches, schools and medical facilities by the turn of the 20th century, intent upon converting Muslims into Christians. This also took place after the 2003 attack on Iraq by America, with the expressed permission of the American government, much of which was done in secrecy, having no regard or respect for the practice of Islam as the main religion in Iraq.
Sie sprechen vom Heiligen Krieg. Sie sehen sich als Märtyrer. Andere Religionen sind für sie Ketzerei. Klar denken Sie, es geht um radikale Islamisten. Nein, diesmal nicht. Diesmal geht es um radikale Christen. Mehrere Millionen solch strenggläubiger Fundamentalisten gibt es in den USA. Ihnen verdankt George Bush seine Präsidentschaft. Aber diese christlichen Fanatiker treten nicht nur in Amerika auf. Sie wollen die ganze Welt bekehren. Eine ungeahnte Chance dafür hat jetzt ausgerechnet der Irakkrieg eröffnet. Gleich nach der militärischen Einnahme kamen die Missionare. Und während täglich auch heute wieder Menschen sterben, versuchen sie, Muslime zum christlichen Glauben zu bekehren. Meist heimlich, aber mit Erlaubnis der US-Regierung.
The war on Islam took shape from this point on, with no reprieve in sight. The US oil corporations began probing Mesopotamia for commercial opportunities in the 1910s, before the total fall of the Ottoman Empire around 1920, after which Europe set its sights on carving new boundary lines of the Levant and Middle East, along with its ally America, though indirectly. which has to this day caused ongoing tensions that have spilled into many wars over the last century. America and Europe moved forward hand in hand to ensure that these borders remained unchanged, and have even shed blood to protect their insatiable interests in the Middle East, the blood of the guilty and innocent alike, exterminating millions of people throughout the century. And all of this cold-blooded murder has no meaning to them, as long as they dominate and usurp whatever resources they can. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Ottoman territories had become the focus of European power politics. British interest in Iraq significantly increased when the Ottomans granted concessions to Germany to construct railroad lines from Konya in southwest Turkey to Baghdad in 1899 and from Baghdad to Basra in 1902. The British feared that a hostile German presence in the Fertile Crescent would threaten vital lines of communication to India via Iran and Afghanistan, menacing and hindering British oil interests in Iran and perhaps even India itself. In 1914, when the British discovered that Turkey was entering the war on the side of Germans, British forces from India landed at Al Faw on the Shatt al-Arab and moved rapidly towards Basra. By the fall of 1915, when British forces were already well established in towns in the south, General Charles Townshend unsuccessfully attempted to take Baghdad. In retaliation, the Turks besieged the British garrison at Al-Qud for 140 days. In April 1916, the garrison was forced to surrender unconditionally. The British quickly regrouped their forces and resumed their advance under General Stanley Maude in December 1916. By March 1917, the British had captured Baghdad, advancing northward in the spring of 1918. The British finally took Mosul in early November. As a result of the victory at Mosul, British authority was extended to all the Iraqi provinces with the exception of the Kurdish highlands bordering Turkey and Iran, and land alongside the Euphrates from Baghdad south to Nasiriyah and the Shia cities of Karbala and Najaf. The British government used their military and intelligence to play different sides of the ruling factions in the region. They exploited the rivalry of the two Arab leaders, the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein ibn Ali, and Abdulaziz ibn al-Saud, the founding king of Hijaz, what is known as Saudi Arabia today. The two Arab leaders were not aware that this was a ploy by the British. Nevertheless, the fall of the Ottoman Empire was imminent, and with it came a new wave that swept over the Levant and Middle East in the form of Western imperialism.
Back in London, in the spring of 1916, Britain was negotiating with France about the future shape of the Middle East. Behind closed doors, Sir Mark Sykes of the British Foreign Office had been meeting his French opposite number, François-Georges Picot. Britain knew it was vital to offer the French a stake in the spoils of the Ottoman Empire, should they win the war. Poring over a map of the Levant, Sykes and Picot personally drew in the areas they wished to see under their control. Their secret deal amounted to the virtual carve-up of the Middle East. In Area A for the French and Area B for the British, the imperialists intended to exercise power indirectly. The area coloured yellow represented Palestine and was envisaged as an international zone, except for Haifa.
What the British wanted was the oil of Iraq, and they concentrated on getting Iraq and getting away from Iraq to the Mediterranean in order to transport this oil. So they got Haifa on the Palestinian coast, and they got most of Iraq.
The Sykes-Picot agreement was a pretty shameful document, and I wouldn't attempt to defend it. But it was drawn up by people who were sort of operating under the old kind of balance of power considerations in an imperial frame of mind.
There was an interview with Abdulaziz ibn Saud when he called the Sharif of Mecca a trivial and unstable character, and he made it clear that he would never succeed to his leadership. He said that even if Hussein ibn Ali would declare himself Caliph, he would not make any difference concerning the status Ibn Saud had among the other chiefs. No doubt, Ibn Saud was Hussein ibn Ali's greatest rival in the region. Ibn Saud was actually British India's man in Arabia. These were the big oil conglomerates that envisioned a bright future in the region. Thomas Edward Lawrence, a British archaeologist, military officer, diplomat and writer who studied at the well-known Jesuit institution, the Jesus College in Oxford, played a major role during the Sinai and Palestine campaign and the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. His activities and associations, and his ability to vividly describe them in his writings, not only earned him international fame as Lawrence of Arabia, but is a historical proof that the British intelligence were not only working over rivaling factions in the region, but had extensive goals for Iraq back then, and in the future to come. Despite imposing as Islamic reformists, the Wahhabis were hardly representative of Islam. Lawrence reported back to the British government regarding the interview with Ibn Saud and said the Wahhabi sect was composed of marginal medievalists, and if it prevailed, Britain would no longer have the tolerant, or should we say, the obedient rule of Mecca under Sharif Hussein ibn Ali and the obedient rule of Damascus.
In the great Arab revolt, King Abdallah fought alongside Lawrence. He learned to love Britain, and in these days of trial, he was our friend. For this, he died.
Lawrence believed at that time the Wahhabis in Najd would be intensified and swollen with success, and their influence would spread. Lawrence's warnings about the Wahhabis proved to be true then, as much as it is with their ancestors today. In May 1917, Hussein ibn Ali Sharif of Mecca learned from the French diplomat Picot that France and Britain wanted to play a role in Arabia's future, and that the two countries had already drawn up boundaries in Arabia. Picot was referring to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, concluded the year before, and still remained a secret at the time of their meeting.
Well, General, I will leave you. Major Lawrence doubtless has reports to make
about my people and their weakness and the need to keep them weak in the British interest. And the French interest, too, of course. We must not forget the French now.
I've told you, sir, no such treaty exists.
Yes, General, you have lied most bravely, but not convincingly. I know this treaty does exist.
Treaties?
He does it better than you, General. But then, of course, he is almost an Arab.
You really don't know?
Then what the devil's this?
It's my request for release from Arabia, sir.
For what reason? Are you sure you haven't heard of the Sykes-Picot Treaty?
No. I can guess.
Don't guess. Tell him.
Well, now, Mr. Sykes is an English civil servant. Mr. Picot is a French civil servant. Mr. Sykes and Mr. Picot met, and they agreed that after the war, France and England should share the Turkish Empire, including Arabia. They signed an agreement. Not a treaty, sir. An agreement to that effect.
There may be honor among thieves, but there's none in politicians.
And let's have no displays of indignation. You may not have known, But you certainly had suspicions. If we've told lies, you've told half-lies. And a man who tells lies, like me, merely hides the truth. But a man who tells half-lies has forgotten where he put it.
Hussein ibn Ali was never told about the plans drawn out in this agreement, but in time his son Faisal came to know of this plan. It was just a year before that, on June the 10th, 1916, that the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein ibn Ali, fired a shot from the window of his palace, signalling the beginning of the revolt against the rule by the Ottoman Turks. Within 3 weeks, Hussein's 5,000 warriors forced the 1,400 Turks stationed around Mecca to surrender. The rebellion against the Ottomans continued in alliance with the British war effort. Hussein ibn Ali's intention was to create a single unified Arab state across Arabia, including Palestine, to the Turkish border. Some Arab Muslims considered fighting alongside Christians as betraying Islam. Hussein's son, Faisal, portrayed by Alec Guinness in the movie Lawrence of Arabia, in charge of his father's rebellion, was motivated by Arab nationalism and a desire for independence from rule by the Turks, more than he was by religious doctrine. He believed that he and his father had a right to power as descendants of Prophet Muhammad, and he and his father ignored the criticism. Back in 1921, the two brothers, Faisal and Abdullah, the sons of Hussein ibn Ali, who led the Arab revolt, were supposedly rewarded by the British and made rulers of Mesopotamia and Transjordan respectively. These were territories captured by the British from the Ottoman Empire between 1917 and 1918 and were awarded by the League of Nations to Britain as mandates. This territory was supposedly to be held in trust for eventual independence, while the mandatory power built up the administration and infrastructure. Faisal was awarded Iraq and became king of Iraq, while Abdullah was emir and then king of Jordan. Faisal soon became disillusioned by the West and felt they had gone back on what they had promised him. Jordan's King Hussein and his cousin King Faisal of Iraq, the son of the Sharif of Mecca, had an unprecedented meeting monitored by the British.
Jordan, a new Arab federation was in the making when King Hussein and his cousin King Faisal of Iraq met in Amman. After days of discussion, King Hussein's plan to unite his impoverished country with the oil-rich kingdom of Iraq was finally accepted. Though King Faisal heads the new state, each monarch retains his own kingship, and they shared the honors at a Jordan Army Officers Club.
Hussein ibn Ali launched the Arab revolt against the Ottomans in 1916 in response to British promises of independence. He made himself king of the Hijaz, the strip of Arabia along the Red Sea, but lost it in the mid-1920s to the fundamentalist Saudis. Hussein ibn Ali and his eldest son Ali, who had tried to fight a rearguard action against Abdulaziz ibn Saud as king of the Hijaz 1924 and 1925, each found ready-made exile in the British-sponsored realms of Jordan and Iraq. The administration and infrastructure in a country that had become a backwater in the former Ottoman Empire, and 3 generations ruled as kings of Iraq for 37 years. The urban Faisal I, between 1921 and 1933, had been a member of the Ottoman Parliament, but while participating in his father's Arab revolt, became a friend with none other than Lawrence of Arabia himself. The British-sponsored monarchies in Iraq, Egypt and Libya did not last. However, the reign in Jordan, with Abdullah between 1921 and 1951, Dalal 1951 till 1952, then King Hussein from 1951 till 1999, and then Hussein skipped this succession and handed over power to his son, King Abdullah II, in 1999, who is still ruling to this day. In this brief historical account, the seeds of imperialism were planted. No doubt it was one of the first phases, and as the Arab rulers died and their sons and family members succeeded the thrones, America, the new world power, ensured that their former operatives' works were not in vain. The West continued operations and continued to groom their future rulers in the region. Saddam Hussein was that next big play for America.
Saddam, meaning he who confronts, was more than just a brutal dictator that oppressed Iraq for more than 30 years. Saddam Hussein was more than a tyrant who defiled and tortured his own people. Saddam was a traitor, a conspiracy, and danger unto his own self. Saddam, he who confronts, was confronted by the United States in 2003, and his reign soon ended with a jolt. So how did he essentially make it into politics? It is true, Saddam was devastated when he was unable to pass the entrance exam for the military. Many people assumed he was a military officer because he would often walk around in military fatigues. But he wasn't. He was something different. His uncle groomed him for something much different. Saddam's uncle was an ardent Arab nationalist, socialist, or ultra-nationalist. He was involved with deep state operations between Iraq and the United States, which was a pressing factor that resulted in what became of Iraq in that time. Iraq, which had been a British colony from the end of World War I until 1932, was overwhelmed with internal power struggles. One of the groups vying for power was the Ba'ath Party, to which Saddam's uncle was a high-ranking member. In 1957, at the age of 20, Saddam was invited to join the Ba'ath Party. He started out as a low-ranking member of the party, responsible for leading his schoolmates in rioting. But in 1959, he was chosen to be a member of an assassination squad. On October 7th, 1959, Saddam, along with others, attempted to assassinate the then Iraqi President, General Qasem, but they failed miserably. As many of you already know, Saddam Hussein was an ally to America and worked in conjunction with the CIA, who were responsible for this planned assassination.
Now, probably a lot of you know that Saddam has been our boy for a very, very long time. You may remember Abdul Karim Qasim, who was president of Iraq in the early 60s. Qasim came up with a unique concept. He said, Iraqi oil ought to go to benefit the Iraqi people. But we didn't like that very much. He began to tax the oil companies, particularly the British and some American companies, and threatened to nationalize our oil companies. And so we decided that Qasim had to go. The CIA sent an assassination team. It was headed by a man who was still going through high school, an Iraqi citizen who was still going through high school. They riddled Qasim's car with bullets on the streets of Baghdad and missed him. The head of this assassination team was wounded and fled to Syria. His name was Saddam Hussein. He was a CIA agent in those days, an assassin for us. And so, and we sold him a lot of, and gave him a lot of tanks. We built him, Bechtel built him big chemical, I don't know, my father-in-law was chief architect at Bechtel, built Saddam big chemical plants that were used, and we knew that they were used to make mustard gas and other chemical weapons that were being employed against the Kurds and later the Iranians. We knew this, but we sold him these things.
PBS Frontline reported that after Saddam attempted to assassinate former Iraqi President General Qasem and fled to Egypt, he repeatedly visited the US Embassy and met with CIA agents who were interested in the downfall of the Qasem government. When Saddam returned to Iraq, the CIA set him up in an apartment in Baghdad on the Al-Rashid Street, directly across Qasem's office in Iraq's Military of Defense, to observe his movements. In 1963, Qasem was assassinated in the first Ba'athist coup. The US was among the first nations to recognize the new government, with Saddam Hussein as its president, and arms shipments began immediately. America certainly had a mission, and on the eve of the coup, the CIA offered up a list of over 800 Iraqi communists to the Ba'athist insurgents. All of those communists were killed on demand of the CIA. Roger Morris from the New York Times interviewed Robert Comer, a National Security Council aide to President Kennedy. He described it as almost certainly a gain for our side. The plan didn't materialize according to the wishes of the USA. The Ba'athist government collapsed within 9 months. Over the following 5 years, the CIA backed 2 more Ba'athist coups. And while the giant corporations kept their billions, the Iraqis were left with failed projects, a war-torn country, and little money to recover. In 1968, the final Ba'athist coup brought Ahmed al-Bakr to power, who then placed his cousin, Saddam Hussein, in charge of the state security apparatus, a pretty high position for someone who failed to even get into the Iraqi military academy. In 1979, CIA asset Saddam Hussein seized power in a palace coup. He liquidated all political opponents as Western-backed coups normally do, just as we saw in Libya with Gaddafi, just as we are now seeing in Saudi Arabia with Mohammed ibn Salman in the latest Saudi purge, removing all opposition that stands in his rise to power, completely backed and supported by the United States, of course. The CIA's plan in Iraq came full circle in the best timing. In 1980, the incoming Reagan administration, seeing the Islamic Revolution in Iran as a threat, encouraged Saddam to invade Iran with promises of arms, money, and intelligence. In addition to billions of dollars in arms, the Reagan administration provided the Iraqi regime with chemical and biological weapons.
According to declassified CIA documents that were discovered at the National Archives using satellite images, U.S. intelligence officials conveyed the location of Iranian troops to Iraq, fully aware that Hussein's military would attack with chemical weapons, including sarin, a lethal nerve agent. And it gets worse. According to those same declassified CIA documents, senior U.S. officials were being regularly informed about the scale of the nerve gas attacks. They are tantamount to an official American admission of complicity in some of the most gruesome chemical weapons attacks ever launched.
I repeat, chemical and biological weapons. Weapons that carried bacteria causing damage to major organs, causing the most horrific birth defects, true weapons of mass destruction. All this aid and weaponry was given with full US knowledge of the repressive nature of Hussein's regime and his support for international terrorists at the time, such as Abu Nidal. The US State Department once termed Abu Nidal's group the most dangerous terrorist organization in existence. He was a terrorist mercenary who worked at various times on behalf of Iraq, Syria, and Libya, and it is claimed even Israel. But the United States needed this terrorist in Iran, and so they had their guy to do it. Just 1 year later, after the dealings between Iraq and the United States, Iraq used US-supplied chemical weapons against Iranian troops.
And if we really want to judge President Bush's stewardship of policy, then we had better pay attention to that detailed record, which provides a deeply disturbing look at a blatant disregard for brutal terrorism, a dangerous blindness to the murderous ambitions of a despot, and what certainly appears to be an ongoing effort to hide the facts from the American people whose tax dollars paid for this policy and whose sons and daughters risked and lost their lives in its pursuit. But the overriding issue was whether Iraq could continue to hold on in the war with Iran. That's all that seemed to matter. In pursuit of that objective, the Reagan-Bush administration would overlook the fact that it was an Iraq-based group that masterminded the assassination attempt against Israel's ambassador to the United Kingdom, which occurred in June of 1982. This event, of course, triggered Israel's invasion of Lebanon, not exactly a minor consequence for U.S. policy.
The Iran-Iraq War stretched out for 8 long years and claimed over 1 million lives and drained the Iraqi economy. After the war on Iran ended in 1988, Iraq's former ally Kuwait flooded the world oil market, lowering oil prices worldwide, and similar to Iraq's condition after the war in 2003. This prevented Iraq's efforts to rebuild its war-torn economy and infrastructure. Saddam Hussein's pleas to OPEC concerning military action against Kuwait fell on deaf ears. But he didn't stop there. After all, he was known as he who confronts. He informed the US about his plans to invade Kuwait, and so the former US ambassador, April Glaspie, told him, "We, the United States, have no opinion on your border dispute with Kuwait. James Baker, the then Secretary of State, has instructed our official spokesman to emphasize this instruction." Saddam, the CIA asset, received the green light to invade Kuwait. The US intended in 1991 to trick Saddam and were directly responsible for the horrific slaughter of retreating Iraqis on the road back to Basra, Iraq from Kuwait, known as the Highway of Death.
How do we stop the Iraqis from returning this military equipment to Iraq? So we put airplanes that night in across the highway.
The aftermath of the needless death and destruction of fleeing civilian men, women and children, as well as Iraqi military who were complying with the President Bush Sr.'s orders to retreat, were being bombed and sprayed with DU weapons, exceeding anything Attila the Hun barbarians ever did in history. The Bush Sr. administration pounced on the opportunity, turned on their promises to their puppet dictator, and prepared for war. Iraq did offer to withdraw from Kuwait, but it was too late. The Americans had their justification for war, which is such a sad moment in history. The US loved war and thrived on it. It certainly didn't mind and completely aided in the terrible war against Iran that killed an estimated 1 million people. But of course, other factors come into play, like the growing relations between the United States and Saudi Arabia at the time. The Saudis were becoming the new oil kingdom of the world, and the centers of power began to shift. The United States has for decades sought to play a more prominent role in the Gulf region, while the unresolved conflict with Iraq provides the immediate justification. The need for a substantial American force presence in the Gulf transcends the issue of the regime of Saddam Hussein. That's why Saddam Hussein remained in power for so long after the confrontation with Kuwait, as he was still very useful to the US. Until 9/11, one of the largest false flag attacks in history.
The proofs are undeniable. The US-Israeli involvement is undeniable. And you can see all of that and much more on the new 9/11 documentary series right here on the channel of the Black Banners of the East. But once more, 9/11 was used as a pretext for the Bush Jr. administration to launch another war against Saddam Hussein in Iraq. It was an opportunity for George W. Bush Jr. to finish what his father and the evil neoconservative elite had begun so many years ago. Of course, we remember the words echoing throughout the satellite frequencies for years: weapons of mass destruction.
Before September the 11th, many in the world believed that Saddam Hussein could be contained.
He has not developed any significant capability with respect to weapons of mass destruction. He is unable to project conventional power against his neighbors.
We are able to keep arms from him. His military forces have not been rebuilt.
Leaving Saddam Hussein in possession of weapons of mass destruction for a few more months or years is not an option. Not in the post-September 11th world. That intelligence was good, sound intelligence.
We've got no evidence that Saddam Hussein was involved with September the 11th.
I don't think we ever said, at least I know I didn't say, that there was a direct connection between September the 11th and Saddam Hussein.
The war on terror, you can't distinguish between Al-Qaeda and Saddam when you talk about the war on terror.
And nobody's ever suggested in this administration that Saddam Hussein ordered the attack.
But he did go to Prague and he did meet with a senior official of the Iraqi intelligence service.
Excuse me for a minute, please. The world changed that day because we had to deal with threats. No question, Saddam Hussein did not order the attacks. On the other hand, Saddam Hussein was viewed as a threat.
Critics are the only people I've heard use the phrase immediate threat. I didn't. The president didn't.
He's a threat because he is dealing with Al-Qaeda.
I don't know anybody that I can think of who has contended that the Iraqis had nuclear weapons.
And we believe he has, in fact, reconstituted nuclear weapons.
You said you knew where they were.
I did not. I said I knew where suspect sites were, and we were just...
You said you knew where they were, near Tikrit, near Baghdad, and north,
east, west, south, and north.
I probably should have said we know where they were, instead of we know where they are.
But so far they found no weapons.
I wouldn't say that.
At the time was we thought he had weapons of mass destruction. Turns out he didn't, but he had the capacity to make weapons of mass destruction. But I also talked about the human suffering in Iraq. Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere.
Even if he did possess them, we know the United States would have supplied them to him in the first place. They should have cleaned up their own mess in a different way. But it's clear that the mess they wanted to clean up was their rogue CIA asset, but more importantly, their failing puppet regime. Regardless, it became clear that WMDs simply did not exist.
Does Iraq possess weapons of mass destruction?
There is only one truth, and therefore, I tell you, as I have said on many occasions before, that Iraq has no weapons of mass destruction whatsoever.
News quickly spread that President Bush Jr. and British Prime Minister Tony Blair were lying about WMDs and using it as a pretext when UK's leading weapons inspector Dr. David Kelly was found dead in the woods at Harrowdown Hill in the UK. Government sources cite the extreme pressure and stress of this otherwise unknown doctor and weapons inspector being thrusted into primetime front-page news. He was found with his wrist slit and a few packs of painkillers in his jacket pocket. A plausible suicide for anyone watching CNN or Fox News, just like the countless hangings and small-engine airplane crashes, removing any opposition that stands in the way of the neoconservative plans to build their new Rome. What concerns did Dr. David Kelly stress shortly before his death, I wonder? He expressed to the BBC News his deep concerns that the UK government was sexing up, as he called it, its dossier on weapons of mass destruction.
British journalists accompanying the Prime Minister were given a document supposed to strengthen the case for war, but a chunk of it turned out to be lifted off the internet. It would become known as the dodgy dossier.
Only recently, with the publication of the Hillsborough Independent Panel Report, has the extent of police dishonesty and cover-up became officially recognised. The panel concluded that it was impossible that Dr. David Kelly had bled to death, that the dose of painkillers near him and in his system was non-fatal, and that there were too many inconsistencies from eyewitness accounts. The real question is, what was the extent of the MI5's involvement? What happened to Dr. Kelly's computers and documents concerning Iraq and the bioweapon case? Why did Lord Hutton place a 70-year embargo on the release of the post-mortem documents concerning Dr. David Kelly? Many public officials were speaking about this. General Anthony Zinni, the former Commander-in-Chief of US Central Command, the one who had access to the most sensitive US intelligence on Iraq, said he was shocked when he heard Dick Cheney start the campaign on pushing weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. He said, "In doing work with the CIA on Iraq, through all the briefings I had at Langley, I never saw one piece of credible evidence that there was an ongoing program. This unwarranted and illegal war that is responsible for countless war crimes, this invasion that has left thousands upon thousands of Iraqi civilians dead and millions of others living in a war-torn country, including the deaths of hundreds of American soldiers. For what? For an occupation that never seems to end, was all carried out on a lie. And they knew it was a lie. These government officials of the USA and UK should be tried for war crimes, plain and simple. It's not necessary to go into how deep and how low these tyrants go. We don't have to analyze too much these days. They have become so arrogant and have assumed so much power over the people, they just tell you themselves."
Imagine what the world would be like with him in power. The idea is to try to help change the Middle East. Now look, part of the reason we went into Iraq was the main reason we went into Iraq at the time was we thought he had weapons of mass destruction. It turns out he didn't, but he had the capacity to make weapons of mass destruction. But I also talked about the human suffering in Iraq. Imagine a world in which Saddam Hussein was there, stirring up even more trouble in a part of the world that had so much resentment and so much hatred that people came and killed 3,000 of our citizens. You know, I've heard this theory about, everything was just fine until we arrived, and kind of stir up the hornet's nest theory. It just doesn't hold water as far as I'm concerned. The terrorists attacked us and killed 3,000 of our citizens before we started the freedom agenda in the Middle East. What did Iraq have to do with what?
The attack on the World Trade Center.
Nothing.
People gathered in their cities all over the world to protest against the war on Iraq. The British, of over 250,000, not only protested the war, which turned out to be one of the largest demonstrations ever put together in the UK history, but they also demanded that Tony Blair be accountable for what he has done. They continued, and they still continue today.
February 15th, 2003 saw the largest protest in British history. Like millions of others across the world, the British public said no to the invasion of Iraq. Their government ignored them. So 2 million people marched on Britain's cities, supported by millions more, but Tony Blair still took this country to war on what is now apparent was flawed or even fraudulent intelligence. Since then, Britain, much like the US, has entered an era of continuous warfare. Today, in a world more complex and with a so-called war on terror that has spread to many more fronts, Britain's anti-war movement is taking stock.
Effectively, what we notice in the United States today is imperial continuity.
In 2003, CIA asset Saddam Hussein was handed over to US occupation forces in Iraq by an undisclosed Iraqi group. Saddam Hussein was executed. The war was over, right? No. The world witnessed more killing, a stronger occupation, more and more war crimes. The truth was becoming known to the public, and this time it wasn't just the likes of Edward Snowden and WikiLeaks, or from the likes of the so-called conspiracy theorists, or what the evil elite loves to call YouTube movies. The truth was spilling out from the testimonies of the US soldiers themselves. Soldiers came back to horrible conditions. They lacked proper health care. They found themselves without their promised bonus checks. They were broke. They found themselves homeless, fleeing the country to Canada and other nations to escape the horrible, horrific crimes they were forced to commit. But that's not all. In fact, there were several soldiers who converted to Islam after the kindness and mercy they saw, even after the extreme oppression and brutality they were causing.
My name is John Michael Turner. I currently reside in Burlington, Vermont. I served with Kilo Company, 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines as an automatic machine gunner. There's a term, once a Marine, always a Marine, but there's also the term, eat the apple, F the Corps. I don't work for you no more.
This could have been her husband. I couldn't tell because he was so messed up. And a woman that was bleeding, but not severely. And all she was screaming, "Why, Laish, Laish?" And I broke down. I leaned up against the wall, and as my rest of my Marines cleared through the building, and I sat there with the corpsman trying to do something about it. But I started to cry. I wanted to rip my hair out, what hair I did have, and go nuts. And the woman, seeing my reaction, came up to me and put her hand on my cheek and said, "Inshallah," which is God's will. Because these people over there, doesn't matter what bad things happen to them, that they can accept it right away as God's will because they're deeply religious. But no, it wasn't God's will. It was my. I gave the order to fire those rockets into that building, and I killed her family.
A former U.S. Marine has made the revelation that he helped to create ISIL.
You know, we were witnessing on a day-to-day basis my fellow Marines kill innocent people, torture innocent civilians, destroying property, mutilating dead bodies, running over dead corpses, laughing and photographing people while doing so. I knew what I was seeing deep down inside. I knew that it was wrong. I knew it was immoral. I knew it was unjust. I knew it was illegal.
The United States fought in Iraq for 9 long years, and we have seen their track record over time. Great war crimes were committed. But we hope for the sake of the American people that you listen to those who fought for the American government, men and women just like you, or just like your sons and daughters, testifying about their first-hand accounts and what really took place in their pointless war on Iraq. With the exception of the war in Afghanistan, Iraq was the longest combat engagement ever, and we know that any time a country enters into a war, or war is forced upon it, it will no doubt change in one way or another. It is inevitable that there is a before and an after. There are the dead, the wounded, the survivors, and of course, there is the change in policy. In comes America's so-called democracy, the supremacy of the few and most evil people on the face of the earth, which is not only in extreme opposition to the supremacy of God, it is just a flawed system that will always fail. Whenever people choose to serve one who is not chosen by God, whether the time is sped up or delayed, the system will always fail. One of the first places America released images of men and women lining up at polling booths was none other than in Basra, Iraq, one of the epicenters for the Iraq invasion led by Paul Bremer.
He thought Iraqis were better off as a result of the war. Fast forward to today, 3 years later, during which we've seen the rise of the self-proclaimed Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and former U.S. occupational authority in Iraq, Paul Bremer, hasn't changed his mind. See, Bremer had so much authority in Iraq when he was in power that his British counterpart, Hilary Sinnott, recounted in his memoir, Bad Days in Basra, how Bremer once snapped, quote, "I am the law."
The Coalition Provisional Authority, following the 2003 invasion of Iraq by the United States. A man who was at one time an assistant for the evil Henry Kissinger, who has dedicated his entire life for the development of the New World Order. A man who has always been surrounded by the neoconservative elite. A man who has always been at the forefront of financial corruption, adding up to hundreds of billions. So much so that it was his office, Marsh & McLennan, that was initially struck on 9/11, an office that no doubt had all the data and paper trails leading to the entire plot of not only 9/11, but the trillions missing to fund black ops. And documents showing the real reason why they were in Iraq and other areas in the region.
I suppose they had to ensure the evidence was destroyed, in case the controlled demolition of the towers failed. Paul Bremer was one of the top commanders of these operations at the time. And he just happens to be, like all his counterparts who are leaders in US intelligence and military, a member of the Jesuit Brotherhood and high-ranking members of the Knights of Malta. So why did he choose Basra as one of the first and main focus points in the Iraq invasion of 2003? Why did he choose to make Basra one of the first televised voting cities to broadcast to the world? Just why has Basra, Iraq, been such a huge focal point for the American and British intelligence operations? The Ottomans wanted a rail system built all the way to Basra. Lawrence of Arabia and those commanding him knew the importance of Basra. Winston Churchill knew the importance of Basra. Paul Bremer knows the importance of Basra. And so do we.
You have the absolute right to refuse to take part in these criminal wars, and that's a right that all of you should exercise. You have no reason to go put your life on the line and kill and die for profit. We've been to Iraq, we've been to Afghanistan, and we know what these wars are really about. And we joined the military for many reasons. Because we need a college education, because we need a job, because we need health care. And then we joined the military, and they tell us that our enemies are poor people in caves in Afghanistan, or poor people in the deserts of Iraq. But we've been to those countries, and we know that our enemies are not other poor people abroad. Our enemies are the people that laid us off from our jobs, that denied us health care, that make it impossible to get an education. Our enemies are not in the poorest countries on the planet, but right here in the richest one. The occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan alone are costing over $700 million every single day. This is a crime. Every single day, while so many of us are hurting. Well, I think all of us here and the vast majority of people in this country would agree that we can spend $700 million a day better than bombing people that we have no reason to bomb. We can spend $700 million a day rebuilding those countries we've destroyed. We can spend $700 million a day caring for the veterans we get home when they get home, and then we can spend $700 million a day giving every single person health care, a college education, a job, and a livelihood, and a home. That's what we need to be spending our money on. But this government is not going to do that. They're not going to use the money in that way. They're not going to end the wars. And they're not going to do it because it's not our government. It's their government. It's the government of the rich. It's the government of Wall Street, of the oil giants, of the defense contractors. It's their government, and the only language that they understand is shutting down business as usual. And that's what we're doing here today, and we're going to continue to do until these wars are over. Well, it's crystal clear now that these wars are going to continue and expand and go into other countries. That is the trend. That is what we know, that there is perpetual war, and it's only going to stop if the people stand up and stop it. And that's what we're going to do, sisters and brothers. A lot of people ask me, what do we do? Because we all know things are bad. We all see the atrocities on TV. We read about it. We experience it. People always ask, what do I do? Because we always want to know what to do. Do we vote? Do we support a politician? Do we join an organization? What do we do? Well, I'll tell you what we do. It's simple. We fight. We fight, and we fight, and we fight. And we shut down our workplaces. We shut down our schools. We shut down the streets. We shut down business as usual. And we fight until we force the people in there to do what the people out here want.